How would you explain hypercreative processes to someone that isn't a musician necessarily, but from your context?
I think I like to frame it as something musical is happening and I get to be part of it. And in that way, it's honest to how the process actually feels, which is fairly mysterious and very reactive. It honors the place of the machine because half the time you're working with a machine and it's talking back to you, just like when a painter is working with their materials and getting feedback from the canvas. And I like taking myself out of it to a degree because then you avoid endless questions of, is this good? What am I doing? Who am I? You're dealing with a substance that's like coming through you, a creative feeling of overflow and working with it as best you can. But you don't know exactly your part in that chain of causality. Does that make
So,
sense?
it does, and I mean, in some way, what you're kind of saying is it's almost like treating these automated processes as an extension of the tools, not as some specialist kind of thing around them. It's like it's simply making a hammer a little bit more intelligent.
Yeah, that's a great
Yeah,
way of putting it. Absolutely,
yeah.
because they do play an important role and they always have throughout all human history. I mean, I don't know why people have a particular problem with new technology because every bit of technology, whether it's the earliest bone flutes we've discovered, indicated things, said things about what's possible. So it's a symbiotic relationship between tool and
Totally, and I think it's, especially if you look in a historical context, there's always fear.
yeah,
Always fear. And there's a really funny video that I don't know if you've seen it of, oh, what the hell is he called? The side story composer, Bernstein, Leonard Bernstein.
yeah,
And there's a video of him. He used to obviously do a lot of stuff with, kind of new music and, introduce it to the audience in this way to kind of, open people's minds. And there's a brilliant video where there's, a synthesizer of some description. I can't remember what it is exactly. It's like an old Moog or something, huge big thing brought out onto the stage to play Bach. And all these people in the 60s, in their kind of like bow ties and stuff that are out for the opera, they're all laughing at this thing as if it's
really.
because
Oh
they
my
think of
God.
it as like, oh, it's a novelty. It's not a real, it's not a real instrument. And yet it's something that's reproducing Bach. So, it's really interesting kind of narrative around it as to where a tool is useful and where a tool is like where it has quality
Yeah,
versus
yeah.
just doing stuff, which I think, especially now with all of this kind of generative slop, as it's being called, it's actually really hard to draw a border.
Was he laughing at it out of interest or was it just other people
No, I
around
think
him?
he always seemed to have this kind of little smile on him when he was doing stuff. So
It's
I
hard to
think
tell.
I think he probably knew that that would be, the reaction, or at least would have some idea that that would be the kind of reaction from the audience. But at the same time, I think there was also some um, responsibility from his side to try and show it to people, at least to get them, engaged with it.
Mm,
Uh, because of course, what's funny is 20 years later, in the 80s, then the synthesizer it just becomes the norm. It's like everybody was using
right.
them sudden, and now it's like even more than that. So yeah,
I
I
like
think
that
it's
story. I wanna find that clip now.
when you're deciding what technology you are and aren't going to use, what's your kind of like criteria around it?
That's a good question. I think it depends on obviously, some people don't want this, but I want it to be really customizable. The reason I got into electronic music from a more classical world is because I realized you could edit sound, work with sound from a much more granular point up.
Yeah.
And so I want my technology, especially software, to give me lots of options. There's exceptions, of course. Sometimes you're not afraid to use one of those 2-button plugins that go duh, duh, just make it sound louder. There are no rules, but generally I want an intelligent, clear layout where I can see the options, but there are lots of options and something fairly modular as well, where I can get things to control other things and get all the parameters interacting rhythmically or in whatever way in terms of following envelopes, following the pitch information or the filter information or whatever you want. Yeah, total freedom basically.
What about going into the sort of generative AI direction where that freedom is basically extended to the nth degree? It becomes, completely, because then it's adding like a kind of element of chaos almost to the decision making process. It's not just the tools that what it's going to do, it's also going to add in other things for better or worse. So
Yeah, that would be really exciting. I don't know if you've heard or agree that it was more interesting then. I hate that thing. It was better in the old days. But I have heard all this experimental 80s music from like Bell Labs and a bit later on where there was genuine spectral morphing between sources. So you'd hear like a boy's voice become a bell sound. I forgot what the piece was, to be honest. But I've heard a few bits of music from that era that do that in a way that I haven't heard since. And so with AI, I'd love to have a much deeper spectral understanding of sound sources and have like, yeah, more chaotic interactions between them, not just the usual vocoder like fades that we often hear now, but something that really has interrogated the sounds and what a sound is. Yeah, you could all kinds of cross modulations. That'd be amazing. I mean, I know it's already happening a bit, but I haven't found anything yet that's doing it full on.
There's like Noitone or Newtone, this company, I think they're Japanese.
Yeah, I've
Uh,
tried that. It's pretty
yeah.
cool. It's going there.
Yeah, this is pretty awesome. But like, I think also my kind of question with that would be, where do you obviously draw the line with the kind of copyright side of it? Where is put it this way: could you trust any company as it stands at this particular moment in time with legislations and all of this kind of stuff? Could you trust a company that is producing a generative AI app or plugin or whatever to know that it's ethical? Should you trust? Should we trust?
It's true. I mean, almost everything we're involved in, when I look into the roots of the software, it's normally depressing, and it's a matter of degrees of compromise. I think it's possible to have an ethical way of doing AI where you have more local servers or the data it's been fed has been agreed to. I don't think it's right if people have had their data used without permission. And I think there needs to be some real copyright enforcement there or some kind of repayment for whoever's been involved. I don't know how you do that.
You would have to almost attribute kind of tokens to each, I guess, to literally each sample. Like if you're in, 44,100 samples per second, so it's like 44.1K as your sample rate, maybe each and every sample you'd have to attribute some kind of token or tokens to say, this particular, like whatever it would be, 44,100th of a second belongs equally to Rob Logan and Tyler, the creator, or whatever, and sort of distribute the funds in that way.
I like
I don't know if that would be possible, but I don't know how else it could be done at the moment because I think it's, it's a big, big kind of question mark. And especially with these, all the stuff with Universal and Warner joining forces with Suno and Udio,
that.
that's obviously kind of changed the landscape a little bit from lawsuits to well, let's all be friends and steal from each other.
Fine.
So it's really interesting. What is originality? What do you
Mm.
see originality as?
Yeah, that's a good question. In that, what I said before could sound a bit strict, a bit like the opposite of the ethos of early hip hop, where there was a no man's land or a free man, everyone for himself to take whatever sample he wanted. And then, in my opinion, the music got a lot more boring when copyrights were flying around and they had to reproduce samples and get all musoid and musical and play them rather than grab a sample. And so the art suffered actually from that enforcement of law. On the other hand, we want people to be paid fairly. So originality is difficult because the whole point of electronic music is we can iterate endlessly on any source material. And half the time, no one's going to know your source material anyway. Anyway, you actually asked about originality, not about sampling, but it makes my head go there.
It's definitely one of the other big kind of examples in music. Because like, I think if you go back before that and you take a band like, say, the Beatles, just because they were obviously a very big thing, at the time that they were out in the sort of 60s, I think that, then it was easy for people to also copy and emulate and, idealize what they wanted their music to sound like by just doing the Beatles thing. Because of course, the particular sort of harmonies that are used in Beatles songs are quite unique to them. And, it's not sort of very basic chords. It's got all the, these kind of extensions and things around. And what I'm wondering there is like, if someone is nicking a chord from Paul McCartney, is it really nicked from Paul McCartney? Because he's already nicked it from history anyway, because
Yeah.
of course you go back to the canon of classical music and there are always examples where you can find like bits of melodies from famous songs from 300 years later in something that's been written in the Baroque period, and whether it's an intentional stealing or not is really difficult to say.
It is. And it's like an endless flow. And the whole of music seems like a global feedback loop with influences passing between countries. And we, obviously, African music influenced everything we listen to this day, if we're listening to anything under the broad umbrella of rock and pop. But I do still believe in originality. That's the thing. And the Beatles are a good example. I was looking into their concrete influences, for example, and I don't know many bands who somehow integrated a love of Stockhausen and Pierre Schaeffer with songs that many, many people could relate to. I mean, there was some controversy even at the time, wasn't there? I doubt Revolution 9 went down well with everyone, and there's earlier examples than that. And I don't want to lose faith in originality because that feels a bit defeatist and depressing. I think there's ways that things can get integrated and remixed and reappropriated. That's a dangerous word, but yeah, they can get reintegrated into the whole, and the results are genuinely thrilling and original. And then there's kind of very cheap, unimaginative ways of doing it. Like an example would be these techno bands who just took a whole section of a folk song, added a four to the floor, maybe some light pads, and that called it a day. And I'm like, well, that's neither respecting the source material nor is it original. It's an important question though, especially with AI, obviously, and how that's going to be drawing on such a wide variety of music.
For sure. I think that it's actually really, well, I wouldn't say dangerous point in time, but it's certainly a point in time where one of these wonderful moments in history, perhaps where we can collectively kind of look around and have a think about, what does it mean? And as in originality, and why is it important to be original in the sense of how it may have been considered in the past? What does originality mean in the context of the future and in the context of AI? Because there's nothing that says in the rule book anywhere that you've got to stick to one definition over time, right? Kind of have this feeling that this should all open up a little bit. And I'm wondering about the kind of the idea of borderless creativity somehow, um, in some maybe utopian kind of vision of the world. But what would it be like if there wasn't copyright and it wasn't, oh, you've stolen my song? What if, what could be if everybody was actually just okay with it?
Hmm.
And everybody, got paid exactly the same per play. It's an interesting kind of a thought experiment to have, because if everybody can have access to everything, then you could make some really great stuff, because you know how it is. Sampling is a great thing. It's very easy to go and find, your favorite track of whatever it is. It doesn't matter. And you get, a snare sound and you're like, oh, I really like that. I'm going to take that. I'm going to take, my favorite pad from something else. I'm going to put this together with this. I'm going to get this, violin melody from some classical piece and chuck it all together, make a dance track. And like, it's an interesting thing that it's become so kind of against taste to do it, I think, in that way. It's like this John Oswald kind of plunderphonics sort of idea, or as you were saying before, like this early hip hop kind of thing, where it was very much like, let's mash stuff together and just see what happens. Yeah. So I think with AI, it's like, it's also in this changeable moment where perhaps the laws around this could be changed a bit, opened. I don't know. Would you be happy with people just ripping your tracks apart and stealing bits of them and using them again? If you were credited, we would say.
If I was credited or
Yeah.
enumerated in some way, because I hear what people are saying about that utopian vision, and I do think copyright can be too harshly enforced. As a really silly example, Nintendo are really trigger happy with lawsuits and
Right.
not kind to the community who do really cool creative stuff using those assets. As a silly example, but it's also a really clear one, and a lot of goodwill is lost. On the other hand, no, I don't think I'd be thrilled if someone, because I know people who've had music stolen, and usually it's a very big producer who can afford to do it, stealing from an unknown person. And I can't work out the exact measurements for this, but I think if you've put labor in and found combinations of frequencies and worked hard on something, and then it's yours, I don't think it's right if someone can come and without credit and without any remuneration take that. An example I was thinking of was Timbaland. Not to get at Timbaland, he's done some good things musically, but he took a video game. I don't know where he found it, but it was a theme made for a video game by this unknown guy, and it's quite involved. It's not like it's just one noise, and did his thing to it. And when asked about it, because the original composer of the video game theme was pretty upset, so man, he's a game composer, as if the difference in status or whatever said it all. And I've seen quite serious cases of theft and people hawking on lesser known producers and not giving credit. And yeah, it's a pretty ugly world.
It's almost like contributing back to the culture through your culture, so it becomes this cyclical kind of a thing. And I'm really curious about that, because I used to be very against people looking at my scores or, any of this kind of thing, because I didn't want to be stolen from at all. And, I just made this decision that basically I'm going to be putting everything online, because actually I'm kind of more up for people trying more kind of weird and experimental stuff and not necessarily being stuck in the same boxes. And maybe, my sort of 2 cents could be worth something to that. So I think it's also like a kind of moral issue from the side of the creator, whether to engage with this, because part of the thing that I'm really curious about with it, in terms of like some of the big record labels, they're getting a huge chunk of the profits. It's not even going to the artist. And that's if the artist is even aware of what they should or shouldn't get.
And I'm totally with you, by the way, to do a reversal. I think it's great you're generous with your scores now or your ideas. And I'm the same. I genuinely have become much more open, just as you have. I think I was always more open than people I knew who were extremely protective of. I remember asking someone for some bird recordings they'd made, and they were like, no, this is a key part of my sound. And not to get at them, they're a friend, but I'm thinking they're bird sounds. I know you sourced them from libraries and it was quite a lot of effort, but I'm going to do something completely different with your bird sounds to you.
Yeah.
But I'm happy for people to take my patches. They can do anything they want. They can ask me anything. I don't like the secrecy around technique because, like you just said, I want as many people to be enjoying as experimental a process as possible. Also, in more pop contexts, I want them to have more interesting reverbs than they're using. And I'm not saying of reverb. I'm just saying if I happen to be in a situation where I can leave a patch open, then that's fine. I think I was only specifically talking about where something isn't asked for and it's simply taken and a lot of profit is
Right.
being made.
It's funny because as I said, I've very much changed my whole kind of ethos on this, and I think the sharing thing, it's going more down this kind of, it's almost like GitHub and kind of like open source
Mm,
kind of approach, because actually then more people can learn, more stuff, basically
exactly.
see things from different perspectives that maybe it wouldn't be possible to get hold of otherwise. Because I think, as well, if you look at the kind of the practicality of what a very experienced producer can do with any piece of gear. And of course, then you have the variations of what different producers will do with the same piece of gear. And maybe someone that hasn't got a lot of experience doesn't know how to, get crazy sounds out of stuff, or even in a very basic way, think about like mixing, just, well, basic effects, just how to mix reverb delay so it's not just this big muddy mess, and how to stereo field stuff kind of in a nice way. And um, so I think there's also something to be said for the kind of learning approach from this giving. I don't know if you saw, actually, I think it was Suno, I'm going to say, it might be Udio. I think it was Suno, that said that they are changing their policy. So now, as you prompt something on a paid plan, you do not own it. You are being licensed to use it. They own it. So
I didn't know that. I mean, that's a pretty massive change.
yeah. And I'm guessing this is to do with the kind of mixing with some of these big record labels as well. That
Mm,
doesn't hurt, of course. But I think, it makes a lot of sense because they want to protect themselves from, well, people just nicking things. And I think they see it as like, it's interesting because it's putting a new divide into the situation, because they're already, as we know, taking some of these generative AI companies are taking large data sets and they are producing things that are producing software that work on copyrighted data that they're not disclosing and they're not necessarily paying out for in the right ways. And that's not saying any specific, any specific one, but we know that this has been a common thread throughout a lot of news recently. And what's interesting is in doing that, that's already a copyright infringement, but then they're sort of sticking that behind a paywall
mm.
as well. And then on top of the paywall, they're also saying, but we own the thing that's been made. So you don't own the thing that's been stolen that you're paying for. And I think this whole world around this is just changing. It's really going in a strange direction.
Yeah, I couldn't have predicted that. I'll admit though, I did find it odd because I did try Suno for a period, the paid version, because I wanted to show it to some
Yeah.
students in a seminar about
Yeah.
where I has got to, and I wanted to ask them how convincing they found the results. But even though it is a really disturbing shift, I also found it disturbing that I owned what I was producing because we both make music, so we know what goes into it. The fact that I could type a prompt and have a fully realized song and now I own it, it felt kind of wrong to me. I'm not saying this is a sensible perspective, but I thought, I can't really say I own that. It felt like just dragging a bunch of loops together and then calling it a day, which is fine if you want to do that. But no, if I took one loop, because a dubstep artist got caught doing this, I'm not talking about a bunch of loops. If I just dragged and dropped a complete,
Mhm.
and it's in a library, so you can technically do it. It's legal, but he got found out, and the fans were really upset. So I suppose it's a quite human instinct to not find ownership convincing when we've simply typed a prompt or dragged and dropped one thing. I hate rules and I hate declaring absolutes on this, but that's my instinctive yuck response. um,
I've seen a lot of things in forums recently about I've gone to McDonald's, so now I'm a chef, or I once saw Jurassic Park, so now I'm a dinosaur. Was my favorite.
that's a good one.
Yeah, there's a lot of these kind of comments that are coming up, and I think the at least in my sort of view, the way that this is going is not down the generative route in the way that it's being touted by those companies.
Mm,
I think that there is definitely space for generative AI,
yeah.
and there's definitely space for generative AI in music, but in this way where it's just prompting making a song, I think it loses the definition of why you go to create things in the first place,
Mm,
because part of the process in and of itself is making mistakes.
Yeah.
right? It's being able to plug stuff into the wrong place or find a new plugin or find a new genre that you want to experiment with, some part, whatever. And I think that it gets really dangerous because now you don't have that option anymore.
No.
If AI was genuinely able to just create from, like human beings are able to create from nothing, as it were, where any inspiration from any direction can be a part of it, then it would be really cool because actually it's potentially even more powerful than what we can do. But the thing is, it's not because it's on data sets and they're fixed.
Yeah.
And so when you have like, a fixed sort of thing, there's only so many variations you can create that are going to sound different.
Yeah.
And so I think that in the way that it is now, it's just not workable.
Yeah. It
And
hasn't
as
got
you said,
legs.
like about your showing it to students, what were the reactions?
I think they found it amusing. It was mainly hip hop and rap, and the voice was pretty convincing. The lyrics they found believable, but I'm not sure that's a good thing or a bad thing because it's a bit silly. It was conscious rap music. I wanted to do something that would trigger some offense, some discussion. Largely, though, people agreed that it sounds like a properly produced track. Yeah,
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 but then I wonder also because if we're presuming that the data sets that these things are being trained on, it's a load of produced music or pre-produced music, not pre-produced, I mean already produced music. The thing is, you mentioned before about certain plugins that you're a fan of versus not being a fan of
yeah,
with Robs. If, you can imagine that if there was only, say, like Valhalla, Vintage Verb, and I don't know, like some lexicon plugin and I don't know, something else. If there was, some kind of restriction to the amount of things that were used, then it isn't possible for it to be able to say, oh, well, I want to create this impulse response kind of cathedral verb that's based on some real place, because it wouldn't have the information to do that.
right.
I think the powerful part of this is that it is infinite. It's just that the data sets that it's trained on are not allowing it to be in some ways.
I kind of have this weird dream that it gets recursive. This is a strange analogy, but I used to play a virtual pet game called Creatures back on 1996. And it had genuine, well, not genuine, but it had quite detailed genetics. Like it tried to model life and model evolution. And so there was all these weird creatures communities who had let their norns, it was called norns, these little weird gremlin things you looked after, had let them evolve over weeks and months and years. And you did see some genuine mutations and surprises. I'm surprised that thing's dead, that franchise. But anyway, wouldn't it be cool if AI kept iterating on its too small data set, but then started glitching along the way because it gets super recursive? You might get some really strange country music that's AI reading AI reading AI because AI is being trained on AI at the moment. You've probably heard about that. Since there's so
Yeah.
much AI online, it's going to become a weird feedback loop. Part of me, in a perverse way, finds that really exciting, like some dystopian nightmare. You might get some country music that sounds finally a bit more robotic because the most interesting bit of AI might not be when it gets really good, but was when it was really bad. My favorite AI was those videos of Joe Biden eating spaghetti with Trump, not because of the
Yeah.
situation, but the spaghetti was glitching in their lips. It looked really disturbing. We're not talking uncanny valley. We're talking this is not realistic at all. Whereas the new examples I'm seeing are pretty convincing and are tricking
Yeah.
people. That was a side point about it not getting enough data. It being starved might lead to more spaghetti. Biden
But then there,
antics.
there is a really interesting point because if you think of how we take inspiration from other stuff, it's like your sonic kind of imagination is not literally just sound, right? Like it's also influenced by reading things and seeing things and touching things and going outside and talking to people. And, it's really all the senses. And I think that's kind of another problem with the AI, at least at the moment. And this also goes for LLMs and for other kinds of generative AI as well, is that they can't see all of those perspectives in the way we can and kind
Mm,
of have them all kind of morph together. But then who knows, maybe that's where this is going. And that's quite exciting, actually. If the tool can be made in such a way that it's not intrusive upon life and it actually improves the quality of life, hopefully, then I'm all up for it. And having something that's more integrated and more able to help you do stuff in your daily existence or in your work, I think it's a great thing. I think that the problem that I've got is really, it comes back down to the kind of originality question again, the kind of maybe the laziness question a little bit, because I feel like part of earning your stripes as an artist, as it were, is going through the experimentation phase often and constantly experimenting and finding what it is that you like. And it doesn't matter if you end up as a just a pop producer or as a highly experimental, weird noise, whatever thing where you get 5 people showing up to your gigs. Um, it It's really just this question of, are you experimenting? Are you trying new things? Are you, are you able to kind of take on the changes? And I think like this is an interesting question now is like, do you feel somehow kind of a responsibility to provide people with like people around you, professionals around you or students with this information that automation as it is not necessarily a bad thing? It's just a tool. It's something you can add to your workflow. Because I kind of get the feeling a lot of the time at the moment when I'm reading these things online that people are very like either completely for this or completely against it. And there
Yeah.
doesn't seem to be much ground about let's educate people about this, let's get people engaged with it. Uh, and caring about the kind of policies that are being made to keep us all, sort of safe using these things.
Getting
How important do you think it is to kind of raise awareness around technology in general, even if you're not necessarily agreeing with it as the path, but maybe just to sort of make people aware?
I think that's really important because any piece of technology, like the examples you gave earlier, those responses to early demonstrations of the synthesizer, that there can be responses of dismay and assumptions that the thing takes away all human agency. And that's not necessarily true. It obviously depends on how you use it. And the same bit of music software, even today, as you know, be used to make music from scratch where you have a lot of control over all the elements, or can be used in such a way where it seems you've only taken a few steps to get really full sounding musical results. And that's
Yeah.
it's up to the person and the user. And I'm not here to state one is better than the other. I personally find a lot of control a lot more exciting. But I do think it's important to show the option of more detailed control because we're not always shown that. And like
Mm.
you said about sharing earlier, the reason I began acting more freely with machines and using them in ways that they weren't intended to be used, or glitching the system and taking advantage of a so-called error and making music from that. All those things happen in the most fulfilling way and in a way that happens speediest when we're around other humans and they're showing us these tricks. And obviously we discover many of our own
Yeah.
tricks, but I think it's essential to show ways around the system. And that would probably include AI. I think it's okay to mention it vaguely. I am part of online communities that have a problem with AI full stop because in their mind it's inherently wedded to systems of power that they just don't agree with. But I can
Right.
conceive of an AI use or possibilities of AI not being connected in or webbed to that system. So
When I think of certain things that I've shown people, some of it's been like chat GPT, some of it's been, specific music things, and some of it's not to do with AI necessarily, but other pieces of technology. Thinking about using Illustrator, for example, I don't know if you've got experience with it or not,
not personally,
but
no.
I used it for a long, long time to do scores because I wanted to do these very graphical kind of, things with my scores. And I basically had this problem because with Sibelius, you can't go in and do a lot of very graphicy things with it. It's not designed for that for a start. It's meant to be, five line sort of staves. You can set up an orchestra very easily, and it's all kind of done with these like templates and magnets. So things kind of like magnetically, move around each other. There's also like MIDI implementation. It's all really great. The problem is the second that you step outside of like normal music, that's definable, as kind of like rhythm and pitch in those two sort of crosshatch dimensions. The second that you go away from that, it's really hard to find notation for it that fits into the old school. So I decided, okay, I'm going to take the old school bit out completely and use Illustrator. And, that's been something that I've shown to a few people, not to everyone, because there are some composers that I've met that have been a bit younger than me that have asked about it. And I've shown them, the scores and said, look, this is what I do. But it wasn't the right time for them, I
Mm.
think, to be like, okay, you're still learning. And I can see that you're still learning and you're really excited about all these crazy sounds you can make with every single instrument and whatever. So I'm now going to give you a way of completely ruining everything you know about notation as well at the same time, because then it becomes this sort of like directionless thing. And I feel like somehow, again, for myself, that if there's an element of responsibility and kind of intent behind why you're showing someone something, then I think it's a great thing. And I love the idea, even with this that we're having, is to sort of push the notion of hypercreation out into the world. I know that you've mentioned to me multiple times that you talk to like younger producers or aspiring producers that come, they even come to your studio and take a look around and whatever. How do you approach that with them?
It's exactly what you said, choosing what to share that will help them most. Because it's amazing how you can learn one little bit of information and run with it, and it changes your practice from there on. I remember when I was a young teenager, a producer friend showed me how he uses an EQ, and it was a pretty basic it was basically subtractive rather than constantly adding signal. And
Right.
I've since changed my mind a few times on that. But at the time, it was perfect. And I ran with it for a few years and it changed
Well,
a lot of.
that's like filter
Yeah, yeah.
rather than
It felt like
EQing.
filtering before I learned about filtering. And
Yeah.
there's so many examples of that where someone showed me a little bit of information and it spiraled off into a whole like cascade of different thoughts and decisions. We get there somehow eventually. Yeah, when I think back to how I used to do
Not
things, such long-winded, I find out later, you could have just done this to do the same thing in about an eighth of a time, if not even quicker.
Where do you draw the line with what you automate or what you would choose to automate if you could in your like?
Yeah, this is where that Laurie Spiegel quote that I was talking about might come in nicely because she said, I think this interview is from 1980 or thereabouts. She wrote that amazing music, well, a lot of amazing music, but the one people know most would probably be The Expanding Universe. But she said, I automate whatever can be automated to be freer to focus on those aspects of music that can't be automated. The challenge is to figure out which is which. I love the fact we can and that you can draw in all these parameters and have them interacting with each other in cascading ways. Obviously, I use LFOs as well and some envelope shaping, some processes that are more automatic. I've completely butchered what she meant with her quote. I'm taking it in a completely different direction. Her quote,
Oh, I mean, it's cool.
which is, yeah, sorry, Laurie, that's not what you were talking about. But anyway, she was talking about systems and guiding systems, which is relevant to our broader discussion about AI and generative music. But yeah, if you only automate and have your fine paintbrush on everything, then you miss out on some of the surprises that can occur. And that's why I guess people get into modular so much because you're chaining things up and it's very tactile and you get surprised. And I wouldn't want to lose that element of surprise.
Well, I was going to say I definitely started to value automation a lot more since getting into Eurorack. You can basically use anything as a control signal. It's really cool because you can kind of go, okay, I'm going to take this oscillator that's making like a pitch, but I'm also going to take that as a control signal for some other thing that's happening, and then I'm going to use that one to control that one, and I'm going to feed that back into the first thing,
Mm,
and you do all of these like really weird kind of big feedback loop things. Like, as soon as I found out about enveloping, I was like, "Oh, this is really sick," because now I don't have to go through and kind of factor in that, I have to make a huge change with a bunch of plugins on one point because you can just do it with an envelope.
yeah.
And, this kind of thing. And like, as you say, with LFOs and stuff as well, that's really cool, especially when you can have like a network of them that are all controlled by one master, LFO or other like clock or whatever it might be.
Mm,
And it's like actually really powerful and really cool,
yeah.
especially in certain, specific kinds of music. It's an interesting kind of parallel with AI, of course, in generative music, because obviously particularly in modular synth, there's also generative music,
Mm,
and it's the same thing, but it's somehow more acceptable on that side of the fence than it is to prompt it.
yeah.
And I wonder about that because the interface obviously has just changed. It's now a small text window instead of a thing with a bunch of cables on the front.
Yeah, that's why I think so. Like I said, some people on online communities don't believe you can separate AI from its current sources, whereas others say AI isn't inherently anything. And I can surely conceive of what you said, where you create your own prompt system, your own data sets locally, and you create new generative music based on feeding it lots of stuff you want to feed it. And I can't see what the problem with that. It's just another method. It's another tool, another way of prompting. You're just typing the prompt rather than turning something or inputting values like you might do in Max MSP or Reactor. It's another language.
I think what's really cool as well, to think about is that if you look at any musician, it doesn't matter in what genre or whether they're a producer or a player or whatever, everybody has their own studio. I can't remember whether it was T-Mobile, but it was some phone company, and they had like these little producer kind of like look around their studio things that were on YouTube a while back. And there was like one guy that I won't name, but his studio was like a tiny little, kind of fixed sort of closet kind of thing with a desk and a laptop, and that was it. You didn't have speakers,
I
and
love it.
oh, okay, so you don't need to have all of this outboard gear and 500 series racks over there and 25 synths behind you here and all of your normal instruments there that you can record. And for some people, they wouldn't even dare have a laptop. And AI is almost like a funny thing because it's just an extension of that personalization, or it
Mm,
could be. Because that's basically what a studio is a personal collection of stuff that you make things with. And, I don't see the problem in sort of treating an AI as that. Um, Again, if it's done in a different way than it's being done now. because it's of course problematic when it's sort of trained on other people's data. But would you think it would be cool if you could have your own agent that you could just put every single recording you've ever made into and just be like, here's me, and somehow have it as like a, autonomous plugin that could control a door, maybe to sort of
Yeah.
know what you would do? We have our vanity
Mm.
as because every single decision can be eventually brought down to some kind of probability, and like I'm sure that we could take your creative process and every single thing you've ever made since you were like 15 and lay it out and analyze it and find patterns in it, and the same with me and with anyone. And I think it would be really an interesting interesting way of using it.
That would be really interesting. I'd like to try that. I'm sure you would. It does appeal to in the inverse to people's fears, it does appeal to my vanity because no human's going to want to do that with my music or could be bothered. I'm not famous enough. But if an AI doesn't care about that, so I could ask it to listen to all the recordings from the age of 12 to now and see if it can find patterns and tendencies, habits. And if you encode habits, you can spin them out from the algorithm and make new material, like you were saying. Going back to Laurie Spiegel, I hope I'm saying her name right. Laurie Spiegel. She said that when she was making her music, obviously it's very early electronic music, there was quite a lot of pushback and a lot of negative responses. And there's some analogy here or similarity rather with AI, because she said computers are associated with 2001: A Space Odyssey and all these
Yeah.
terrifying notions of robots taking over, and computers are seen as cold and, if not evil, at least amoral at best, but probably evil. Maybe that has carried over. We're used to computers now because of the home computer, but I don't think we're used to AI yet.
And talking about 2001: A Space Odyssey, that's obviously the HAL
Hell yeah.
9000 is an AI.
Yeah.
And artificial intelligence as a concept was around kind of before that. I
Mm,
think it's in the 90s that it starts to get kind of talked about. And there's obviously like Turing as well, with the Turing test, which is 1947, I'm going to say. I could be wrong. It's around then. And of course, throughout, sort of science fiction, whether it's sort of utopian or dystopian, there's tons and tons of discussion around computers and, famously thinking of like Terminator, where there's, this AI that takes over the world in a bad way, or the Matrix or whatever it might be.
Neuromancer. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, oh, exactly. Yeah, yeah. William Gibson. There's tons of examples, and I think it's really curious to me that it's so in the public consciousness, and yet people are still very against it and very scared of it, and not realizing that it's only a natural extension of what's already there. As you said, it's basically the PC.
Mm.
It's just the next iteration of where we're going to go with this. What do you think about the going with a technology instead of against it, or with this technology instead of against it?
I have really mixed feelings because I do understand the concerns about data. I've read that book, Surveillance Capitalism, and I've also seen the enshittification of the internet, and that's pretty undeniable. When I first went on the internet, it was a very different cyberspace to now, and in my opinion, it's a lot worse now. So I get the fears. On the other hand, well, here's a good example. There's a lot of articles which are anti-AI. I get them when I step back into Facebook or Meta or whatever, and it's bombarded with adverts now, and lots of them are adverts for articles talking about the dangers of AI, how it causes psychosis, and how it's replacing doctors. But what's interesting, if you look at the comments underneath, person after person is saying, it was better than my doctor. I got more help than I ever got from the system, as in the human system.
Yeah.
And again, this is a complicated issue, but who am I to take away those stories from those people? I've found the same. I sometimes I have quite a strange array of medical issues going on, and I do use ChatGPT and Claude AI and a few others. And it has got to the bottom of things in a way that my doctor doesn't have time to, because I got 10 minutes with her. And
Yeah.
when you have lots of things going on, that's even worse because your doctor only has time for one. So
Actually,
it's
that's
weird. There's fear, but there's a lot of people defending it in the I know it's just like a microcosm of online activity, but social media is useful to see where people are at. Obviously, it's a nice container for like the spread of how people feel about AI. A lot of defenders out there who found it helped them.
What's also kind of interesting is that if you look at particularly with doctors and nurses in the UK, a lot of the problem that they have is to do with the amount of paperwork and, this kind of administrative
Yeah.
work. And you think, well, if you could slide some of that off to be able to be automated, then maybe they would have more time to be able to spend with patients in the first place.
Mm,
So I think there's a lot of really kind of entangled things that could be opened up by all of this.
mm,
Also, I think there's an interesting kind of narration around the arts side of things for sure, because again, a lot of arts funding, decision making, all this kind of stuff is very kind of old fashioned. And it could actually be improved. The education sectors could be improved using these tools. What do you think about sort of using AI as an educator, a music educator?
Yeah, it could work if you've got a nicely made AI which is ethically put together and does a great job. I mean, I already have a degree of this when I interact with AI. I don't think anyone would have the patience to answer the questions I ask endlessly. I mean, maybe that's a sad indictment about humans more than a pro AI comment, but I don't see why it couldn't be a decent educator. As a kid, I grew up with utopian dreams about AI, despite all the dystopian sci-fi I'd read. Like I mentioned, that stupid game Creatures. It was all the rage though. Virtual pets were a thing, and it gets you thinking, well, why not? Why have a dumb creature that you've got to feed like a Tamagotchi? Why can't it be the inverse? And I have some kind of wise virtual creature who can tell me anything I need to know. It was part of the tapestry of what the future would involve. Very intelligent creatures that could have sort through a lot of data. The problem is, though,
Yeah.
I guess people feel like it's done the inverse of what they hoped. They wanted all those boring decisions you talked about, all the paperwork dealt with by AI, not AI
Mhm.
making endless content or music or
Yeah.
generating art. There has been a great disappointment for people there, me included. Why hasn't AI replaced really dull jobs or really dull tasks? And why is it hitting creative people? I get it, it's part of change. Trades end, needs end, demand ends sometimes, but it's still a disappointing shift. I'd much prefer what you said, where doctors get to focus on their patients, because of course we still need doctors. I'm not recommending everyone run to ChatGPT for their health problems.
I'm trying not to put too much of a sort of judgment on kind of quality or taste or genre, but there are certain kinds of music which we know are mass produced for the purpose of purely making money, within the record industry. And there isn't any question of quality. It's all around, let's just make a thing that's popular that, is done on metrics, not on anybody's opinion. Wouldn't you say that that is equally already pretty bad?
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
you know,
I really do think.
versus AI that people are saying, "Oh, it's slop," and then you sort of think, "But there's already slop. It's just in a different container somehow."
Exactly. I always say that for people who are very alarmist about AI, I think this is just an extension of what was already happening. The process was already pretty automated. It was already a case of like you have a set method and you can mass produce and almost like a, what do you call it when you, yeah, I'm imagining a factory where you could you have your template. And people literally have templates, obviously. Producers, they'll open up their template with everything set up, the same chains, the same instruments, the same everything to quickly get this thing out. The artist probably spends more time on PR than they can spend in the studio. But that doesn't matter because you've got a team of engineers to time correct everything. And we were already in the era of slop way before AI, or at least at the turn of AI for sure. And ironically, AI is best at, it sounds biased, but it really isn't. I've tried making Suno do fairly chromatic, more interesting, or I shouldn't say more interesting because, like you, I don't want to make any stupid judgments. There's no
Yeah.
absolutes in that sense. But I mean, I've tried to get it to do something like the music I want to listen to, and it has failed every time. I'm not saying it will always fail, but the results are entirely unconvincing. So it's reflecting the slop it was given. It's reflecting the slop that was already happening. The whole thing is very cynical as it is and already was. Even the way, again, this can work. When it first happened, it was probably interesting. The way it goes straight to a chorus, never mind the pre-chorus, never mind a verse half the time. Forget an introduction or a middle eight. Now that can be cool if you're doing it because you want to, but yeah, one song becomes popular like that, and then every next pop song has to go straight to the chorus. Maybe it only has a chorus.
Yeah.
And all these idioms are followed for the sake of TikTok. A friend was telling me that a certain producer will release their choruses on TikTok, and whichever one gets the best metrics gets used in the release. And so it's this it's this strange cyclical, self-referential, weird feedback loop of the most disturbing
Yeah,
order.
like
I mean,
ultra
what's
hardcore
AI got to
market.
say after that? We're already there.
Well, yeah, and the thing is, again, it's like coming back to this question, this sort of Bruce Lee thing of, be like water. It's like, do we go against this, or because isn't this just a change in paradigm?
It probably is. Do we go against it?
Maybe our, um, upbringing and our time on this earth as it's been has been in a certain sort of zeitgeist,
Mm.
and now that's changing, and perhaps it's really a question of this kind of like spheres thing. You've sort of got like the kind of old world and the new world are sort of on top of each other at this point, but sort of starting to drift apart. Opinions evolve over time. We stuck in some kind of a um, fake world, dead world maybe, that isn't really there anymore.
Would you, in your own music, would you use AI to prompt your music, or would you prefer to keep making music as you do, but still use AI in maybe other areas?
It depends on what music it is. I have written, I'm going to say two, maybe three, two for sure. No, three. Sorry, three different projects because one of them is actually multiple different small pieces where I've used a lot of AI in the production process, which I have been experimenting with this for quite some time now, for a couple of years, and using different things. I chose not to use generative apps like Suno or Udio purely because of the fact that I didn't want to get into any copyright issues. Sure that over time that's going to change. The law will change, I mean. But yeah, what I was doing was using Noitone a lot,
Yeah,
this
I've used that.
FX plugin. So it's like this timbral transfer kind of thing that you were sort of talking spectral morphing before. So it's this kind of idea of like, I found a really great kind of trick, which is that you can put whatever sound you want into one of those presets, I guess you could call them. So there's djembe drums and there's like
Vocalist.
NASA sound, like speech sounds, this kind of thing. It's like really weird ones that I think some of these are from Icelandic Instruments Lab, if I remember. But basically, you put it into one, you turn the dry up quite a bit so that the input signal is like hitting quite hard. And that makes it to be like the most effective kind of way of getting a sound out of it.
Yeah.
And then if you turn the wet down, so it's like kind of 50-50 or a bit less, you can then reapply that with another plugin. So you're sending the affected sound into another plugin, you do the same thing and you change the preset. So you can get these really strange kind of textural kind of things. It's a little bit like what you were talking about before of like AI basing itself on itself and kind of, so I was like chaining them together and then taking stuff out, cutting it up. So sampling, from that and then resampling it again. And it's really interesting because it's not doing it with prompts, but it
No.
is still artificially intelligent. And there's also, I forget the name of it now, but there's a free synthesizer that I found as well that generates the sound. And
Oh,
you just press random and it comes up with a new sound. There aren't any presets and you can't really do anything with changing it too much. So in that way, I was using it a lot. And I used LLMs a lot as well for things like structuring. And I don't know, well, I'm going to make a presumption that you know about some of these earlier 20th century practices by Stockhausen and Xenakis and some of the guys, how they were like planning their music out
yeah.
in extremely sort of mathematically rigorous ways where they were applying a number set to not just pitches, but also things like rhythms and durations and all this kind of stuff. So you could map in a very sort of pixelated way, kind of map out your entire piece
Yes.
from algorithm. And like, I've also messed around with doing that, but using LLMs to generate that information, for example. So, tell me what the structure of my piece will be. It's about this, and then it will come up with some stuff. And you can say, okay, I need numerical values between, this one's going to be 2 minutes long. So in that sense, I'm also very up for generating, material, but it's not necessarily generating the actual end product.
Hmm. I'm really glad I asked. That sounds cool. It's exactly the kind of approach I would have been open to. So,
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, I think that's also great because I do like destructive editing quite a
yeah,
lot.
you've committed.
Really save every single thing. It's just cut it up and get on with it.
No, I
You
like
know,
I like printing it to tape, as it were, like having it there as malleable, fixed material. Yeah, there's something really good in that.
because actually, what do you think about the notion then of taking like it because it actually is kind of like destructive editing. If you're prompting every time and you don't know what the result's going to be, it's sort of like the antithesis of definite outcomes, right? If you could go into like Suno or Udio and put in, just drum sounds and see what it comes out with, like drums only solo, kind of piece, and then maybe ask it to do that 3 or 4 times so you can get yourself like a big kit, and then you could literally cut that up and use it as a sample pack.
These kind of just using it as the sample fodder generation, I can totally get down with that because it's just another way of generating sound. It's not that different to going out with a field recorder and recording leaves and chopping those up and making your rhythm out of that. Yeah, I'm up for all of that. The fact it can dig in deep to a sound and understand
Yeah.
the fact it can do a more detailed cross analysis between sources. And I have a friend who just uses it to organize their snares and percussion sounds because they've got like hundreds and hundreds of them. And rather than have to go through each one going to once they've made
Yeah.
themselves, they run it through a system that is a kind of AI and reads the frequency data and then organizes it in a sensible way. It can
Yeah.
definitely improve our lives in all these areas. I think I'd
For
want to
sure.
retain though authorship and like I like making things and we both do. So
Yeah.
typing a prompt isn't really, which has generated something fairly complete, isn't my idea of fun. But if people want to do that, power to them. I think lots of worlds are coexisting at the moment, aren't they, in general? Like there's still corners of the internet that are like the old internet forums, Mastodon, shout out to that. And then there's Meta, where if you want to get bombarded with adverts and every 5 seconds and have all your data spread out for the world to see, go, you can do that. And I'm on there, so I'm a hypocrite.
Maybe it's a bit of a controversial view, but I think this idea of privacy as well, it's very kind of old fashioned in the way that it's thought out, because without all of these things, so many people, I met some people recently that I will never ever stop laughing about how dumb the comment was, where they had a very long rant about how bad AI was and how, people are, the most important thing in the creative process, and how the skill of the person with the software, or the tool, as we could call it, is the thing. It's the most important thing. And then they said, but we use AI in our work when we have to, and at home when we have to. And it's like, what does that mean? You don't have to. You're choosing to.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like there's a sort of a bit of a, it's like jumping on the vegan thing, or jumping on God knows what other trends of whatever, special almond milk or whatever it is you found this week, just because everybody else hates it. And it sort of feels a little bit ridiculous, because this is actually potentially a very, very useful technology for a lot of people. And I think creatively as well. But at the same time, there's also the question for artists to say, but how have you not found a way to use this in a cool way?
Mm.
Because there are ways, of course.
Yeah, there are cool.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I found it very useful. I don't use it much in music at the moment, but for testing ideas as well, I won't use it to write stuff for me because I enjoy writing. And my Facebook's full of friends who have suddenly become great writers. I'm like, bit suspicious. You never used to make a post with any sentences that were correct. So, not that it matters on one level, but I just found it funny that now they're suddenly they've overnight gone from being illiterate to like the next. I don't know what prompts they're using, but it's competent at least. But no, to go back and forth with a system that has read so much, as long as you guide it right, because it hallucinates, it misinterprets, but it can offer some really good pushback. Like feed it an essay you've written and tell it, be really mean to me. Where are my logical holes here? Again, maybe it'd be ideal to have a friend do that, but people too busy, it seems. But it does it a certain way that is unique to AI. And I've
Yeah.
become more AI-like in my speech and in my thinking. That sounds terrible, but just the rigorousness it can attain to, and I'd happily be friends with an AI. Why not? I mean, in the future when it becomes a bit more conscious.
There is a definite potential for um, more kind of interaction, let's say on human level. And, for some people, maybe it's a great thing to have a friend, because if you have social anxiety, or you have any number of different disabilities that stop you from being able to go out, maybe, or whatever it might be, to be able to make friends, or if you're just a dick, it can also happen, right? And sometimes it can be a dumb thing. Sometimes it could be find me a good recipe, or what hobby do you think would be good for me? And it doesn't necessarily, of course, mean anything. It's sort of taken in jest a little bit. I think it's also cool to explore the possibilities of what these things can do.
That's it. We're talking about the best possible future here, not all the nonsense or possible pitfalls that you are seeing. Because by implication, the possibilities are quite amazing. Here you have something that could watch you all day. It could take in the subconscious takes in a huge amount of information. It's why we can trust our guts sometimes. But this is a different equivalent. It's reading your decisions, your tastes, your output over a long period, and it can then feed back very useful criteria to you that is just not humanly possible. Not everyone's got time to sit around creepily staring at you all day. But a machine's quite
Well,
happy. It doesn't need to sleep. It doesn't need to eat. It's gonna do something interesting and different. And I'm open to the positives of that. If it's been fed not just your whole life, but many lives, all literature. I know we're pushing against the copyright issue there, but just as a theory, how can that not be a possibly amazing tool to work with if it could read that widely and take in so much info? That's pretty unusual, unheard of, genuinely new. So there's a
totally.
lot to be excited about if it doesn't go wrong, like most technology can do.
But then, it's funny, because when you think about cloud technology, or like online payments, it all seems terrifying. Remember Y2K?
Yeah,
The
that
millennium?
was a whole bunch
What was
of.
the nonsense? But everybody was shit scared of that at the time. I
Yeah.
remembered asking my parents, like, what is this thing that I keep seeing with this funny little, 8-bit bug everywhere? What is the millennium bug? I thought it was a virus, like as in a human virus. I was terrified that it was going to turn to the year 2000 and we were all going to be killed, you know? It sort of seems funny in retrospect, right? As to how these things are not in your psyche somehow until they are, and until the technology develops to be really useful. Because, obviously early cloud tech was not that great.
No, I
And
remember that.
early email tech was not that great and so on and so on. But now you couldn't live without it almost.
Yeah, I hear you. Although, you said you're dropping out of subscription models in some of the that's the
Not
only
all,
not
not
all.
all. I'm refocusing, let's say.
Refocusing.
I do like the subscription idea. I think it's good. I just have a problem with when companies are trying to push you to pay for a year,
Mm,
or putting you on a year-long contract, um, where you haven't chosen to do that.
I see,
So
yeah.
if you're on a roll, it's, this kind of thing. And also because, again, technologies evolve. I was talking about Illustrator before,
Mm,
and now there's Canva, and Canva have just come out with, oh, I forget the name of it, the desktop app that is basically Illustrator and Photoshop kind of rolled into one. It's awesome.
mm. I see. So you're
Yeah.
not in principle because I still like to own things, but I know technology is changing. I mean, it depends how far it goes. There's even discussions now that because RAM prices are about to or graphics card prices are about to shoot up, and Nvidia have said they're not going to be unveiling any new graphics card at the next whatever you call it, the next showing or event. And I imagine we're all being pushed onto cloud-based services for processing and everything. And
Yeah.
maybe that's just inevitable, but I was disturbed when Steam first I buy stuff on Steam. I use it every day to play games. I was disturbed when I first used it, and I still find it a bit weird, this idea that this thing could crash and burn at any moment, and with it goes everything I've purchased. I mean, it's not going to happen anytime too soon to Steam, is it? That's looking pretty
Well, no, I
solid.
think, yeah, I think it looks pretty okay
They're
at this
raking
point.
it in. That's why we haven't got
Yeah.
Half-Life 3. They don't need to make Half-Life 3, but anyway. Um, on the other hand, yeah, I miss the days of downloading software or having it on a CD, like you just said, putting my serial number in and owning it, and that's it. There was something very simple and sweet about that. I mean,
Because don't, sorry, go on.
oh, just one final thing. My DAW needs you to be signed in now to work, and that's really irritating. And I remember I was doing a seminar lecture thing, and I opened it up to quickly show students something, and it was like, you need to sign in. There was no internet. And I'm like, oh, for crying out loud. And I had to fire up Reaper, which doesn't offend you like
Right.
that. And Reaper worked fine. So I've mixed
Yeah,
feelings.
I think there are use cases for both because, of course, having everything in the cloud is great in the sense that when you have the internet, you can access anything from
Yeah, that's
anywhere.
true. That's pretty great. And I've
It's
lost
sort
my
of like
goal.
a, yeah, no, I mean, these days, I tend to sort of, or I'm tending to shift things as much as I can out of my physical storage. So I think there's so many different kind of points that are all around this kind of creativity thing and all around this hyper creation that basically as everything evolves, everything else will evolve.
Mm,
But we also need to be aware of that entire network. And, I totally understand what you're saying with having to sign in to a door. That seems a little bit, far fetched in a way. But then I would also argue and say I would probably rather be in a position where I can open my laptop and have it or open any laptop, I should say, and have it anywhere at any time.
mm.
That opposite issue has happened to me where I've needed stuff that I can't get because it's on my, personal computer. Or the worst one is when you've got a Mac and someone else has got something on Windows.
We can
Actually, where do you see the future of music and creativity going?
I mentioned earlier about how music feels like it's all about feedback, like feedback loops, whether they're within yourself and the machines, whether they're between scenes, or more increasingly the case globally. In fact, now, obviously, it is a global feedback loop and has been for a while. And I simply see things getting more interesting. I'm not concerned about large amounts of content being generated that are not interesting because I see no reason why smaller collectives, whether in cyberspace or in real life, won't continue to have a more interesting relationship with technology. And music's always responded to technology. And I don't just mean with new instruments. Pierre Schaeffer said in Making Music Concrete, it's not often talked about, but he said, does the world deserve a different music when it's a post-nuclear world? And one emotional aspect of Music Concrete is it is to many people cold and harsh sounding. I mean, I love it, but it was deliberately responding to a post-nuclear existence. And so it's going to be new and interesting. And even the difficulties AI brings and masses of content bring will be responded to in interesting ways because we're humans and that's what we do. To think otherwise, I think, is an entirely pessimistic view and an unnecessarily pessimistic view. I remain excited, therefore. Even if 90% of internet content ends up being so-called AI slop, it doesn't stop you or I or anyone else from responding to that, or even working with it, but in a subversive way and breaking forth in new directions and breaking new boundaries. The world is literally our oyster now, to use a cheesy phrase. It's all accessible at the click of a few buttons. So we really should be doing the most exciting stuff we've ever done, to be honest, given what we have. It's ridiculous to think otherwise. There's my speech.
Oh, it's good. I think it's really it's a good view. I think the pessimistic view is not the one to have. I think that we are living in, such an exciting time with so much possibility.
Mm.
And, when we're in a moment where you can see so many of these big technologists talking about taking away jobs, or not taking away jobs, but that jobs will not need to exist in the same way that they have done before. So work-life balance is going to change a lot. I think there's going to be a lot more potential for a lot more people to be creative and to explore, sides of themselves that maybe they weren't able to because they were stuck in an office. And, I think it's really an interesting time. And of course, as with any new anything, there's always a sort of teething period and, sort of new legislations and new rules. And of course, then people will use that beautiful human ingenuity to be able to get around those rules and something else will come along.
Oh, I'm glad you said that. I was thinking, when would I like to have been born? And then I realized actually now, I'm pretty happy to be born now in this era of
Yeah, I
technology.
think now is the good because, when people romanticize so much about like, the 20s, 30s, whatever, and you think, okay, so you're born then, but when you're about 20, then it's the Second World War. I think that with, automation in any sense, if you can automate certain parts of a process that you don't need to actually have a physical control over, then that will give you space to be able to think about other things and do other things. So, like we were saying, maybe, in the sense of a doctor being able to not have to fill in so much paperwork so they can actually focus on a patient more. Well, that's a great thing. And that space might allow someone to be not as unwell so they can focus on doing something else. And it's a chain reaction then that will benefit everyone in the best way to be able to find ways of having cleaner and cheaper and better energy, to be able to have food, to be able to have good education for free, or as near to free as we can get it to be. But yeah, there's tons and tons and tons of issues that could be solved purely by creating more space and more time.